What's up, everyone? This is Ryan Eckert with Peak Endurance Solutions, and welcome to the VO2 Max podcast. Welcome back, everyone, and if this is your first time tuning in, then we thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoy today's episode. In today's episode, I'm going to be going over the difference between the Zone 3 trap and polarized training. Now, these are two different approaches to endurance training, and one of them, as the name would suggest, is not the type of approach that you want to have, whether you're an endurance athlete or the type of approach that you want to have with the athletes that you might be coaching. Whereas the other approach is generally most effective for promoting long-term improvement in sport while also minimizing the risk of things like injury, illness, and burnout. And I must admit, I wanted to record this episode somewhat selfishly for myself, so that I can share this with athletes that I work with in the future. I find that I tend to have this type of discussion with a lot of athletes that I come across, especially athletes that are a little bit newer to endurance sport or maybe got into endurance sport later on in life. Athletes tend to fall into what I'm going to be describing as the Zone 3 trap. And I tend to need to have that kind of discussion to break them away from that Zone 3 trap. And it would be useful for me to just have an episode like this that I can share with them, where I'm explaining it clearly, and it will hopefully help give them a better sense of why we approach training the way we do. So hopefully this is not only something that is useful for me in the future, but also useful for yourself as an athlete, as well as the coaches out there. Coaches can even use this and share it with their athletes as well. So let's begin by diving into what the Zone 3 trap is. Now, before we can go into what the Zone 3 trap is, we need to have a brief understanding of what the different training zones are. And there are a variety of ways of breaking down training zones, but the most simplistic way of doing it is by breaking it down into 5 different zones. So starting with Zone 1, we have a very easy recovery zone where a lot of really easy intensity is done, and that's Zone 1. And then the intensity increases linearly as the zone number increases, right? So as we go from Zone 1 to Zone 2, the intensity goes up. Zone 3, the intensity goes up even more, and then we work our way up to Zone 5, where Zone 5 is basically like near maximal, almost all-out type of efforts. So that'll hopefully help put the Zone 3 trap into perspective as I'm describing it, but just know that there's, in general, the 5 training zones, and the Zone 3 trap is what athletes fall into when they perform the majority of their training in Zone 3, as the name of that trap would suggest. Now, like I said, this is something that a lot of newer athletes find themselves in, as well as athletes who maybe haven't had a coach yet to help correct this type of error in approach to training. And intuitively, it makes sense to a lot of athletes to go out there and just train kind of hard every time they go out and do a session, right? So this was me when I first got into endurance sport as a runner way back in the day. I initially approached training where every single training session I went out and I just trained kind of hard for however long I was training, right? If it was a 30-minute run, I went almost as hard as I could for 30 minutes. If I went for a 90-minute run, I went as hard as I could for 90 minutes. And then at the end of each of those workouts, I felt like, or at the end of each of those sessions, I should say, I felt like I was getting a good workout, right? And we're kind of incentivized to believe, and there's this misconception going around that in order to improve, you need to get a good workout. You need to feel like you just pushed yourself. And while yes, we need to push ourselves occasionally, we can't push ourselves in every single session. And the trap that athletes fall into when they perform most of their training at that kind of moderately uncomfortable but somewhat sustainable effort is they end up doing most of their training volume in Zone 3, which comes with a few potential downfalls, and I'm going to go over those, and then I'm going to talk about the difference between Zone 3 training versus polarizing one's training intensity, which is generally the type of approach we want to have. Now, with Zone 3 training and doing the majority of your training at that kind of moderately uncomfortable effort level, of course you're going to see improvements initially, especially if you're a new athlete. You're going to see improvements doing just about anything in the beginning. And yes, you're going to see improvements, but those improvements are going to plateau after a while. because first of all, you're just working at the same effort level and intensity all the time. So your body's going to adapt to that initially, and then it's going to get used to it. Second, you're not working at higher intensity zones, which are going to be a much more potent stimulus to improve things like VO2 max and lactate threshold, which we know are associated with improved endurance performance. So you're not giving yourself as much of a stimulus to improve those aspects of your fitness by training in zone 3 all the time. And then you're not getting any of the benefits of training below zone 3, which there's a lot of benefits to be had from doing really, really easy training in zone 1 and zone 2. And I'm going to touch on some of those benefits here in a minute when I start talking about polarizing your training intensity. So that's one of the downfalls of falling into this zone 3 trap, is a plateauing of results after a while. Now, the other major downfall to falling into this trap is that training at zone 3 chronically over time increases the risk of things like injury, illness, and burnout. And this is simply because training in zone 3 at that kind of moderately uncomfortable effort level is a lot more stressful on the body than training in zone 1 or zone 2. So zone 1 and zone 2 is all of your like easy recovery effort levels and truly aerobic effort levels. Those types of intensities don't carry as much physiological toll on the body as training in zone 3 does. So zone 3 work day in, day out brings with it a big physiological toll. And again, you're not getting the benefits of training in zone 4 and zone 5, which the training in those at those effort levels is going to be a much more potent stimulus to improve certain aspects of your fitness. And so over time, you start accumulating all this stress from training in zone 3 chronically. And at a certain point, the body can no longer recover from that amount of stress. And so it begins to break down, and we see things like an increased risk of overuse injury, stress fractures, muscle tears and strains, things like that. And then we also see an increased risk of illness or symptoms of burnout, mental and physical burnout. So we definitely want to be avoiding those, because then that's going to hurt our ability to be consistent and train consistently over time, which training consistently over time is really the king when it comes to being an endurance athlete. You need to be consistent month in, month out, year in, year out to see improvements in the long term. And so as you can see, training chronically in zone 3 is a little bit of a trap. It's enticing to want to go out there and push yourself each workout, and it's particularly easy to avoid going easy on the easy workouts and just push it a little bit more than you should, and then pretty soon you find yourself in that moderately uncomfortable but somewhat sustainable effort level, and you're in zone 3 all of a sudden. And the problem is athletes, even the athletes that know that they shouldn't be going too hard on zone 1 or zone 2 workouts, on easier workouts, sometimes whether it's their ego gets in the way or they're doing workouts with groups and they just want to keep up with the group, they find themselves going a little bit too hard too often, and then pretty soon that creates a massive amount of fatigue that builds up in their body. And then when it comes time to actually do the hard workouts, they're so fatigued from doing all of the zone 3 efforts that they can't really push themselves in the zone 4 and the zone 5 workouts that are intended to build higher aspects of one's fitness, such as like VO2 max or lactate threshold. So now, if we don't want to be training in zone 3 all the time, and that's not the best approach to be building our fitness and seeing improvements in the long term, what is? Now, Dr. Seiler is kind of I don't want to say the founder of this approach to training, but he's really the one who's done a lot of this research to find out how should we spread out the intensity of our training to maximize long-term benefits and improvements in fitness. And so he was the one he didn't necessarily found this, obviously, because athletes were doing this, but he's the one who put a name to it and kind of coined the term of polarized training. And I really like the work that he's done because it makes it simple to understand and digest it. And then there's actually also he's not a researcher, he's more of an author who's looked into some of the research, particularly Dr. Seiler's research, and he's written books on the topic of polarized training. And I'll be sure to link in some resources for Dr. Seiler, as well as that author. His name is Matt Fitzgerald. Some of you may have heard of him. He's written like 80-20 running and 80-20 triathlon. And he's a really good author to read because he summarizes polarized training really nicely. But polarized training essentially is the concept of doing the majority of one's training at a very low training intensity and then doing a very small percentage of one's training at a very high training intensity. And through a lot of Dr. Steven Seiler's research of observing other athletes, he noticed that particularly elite level and professional level athletes spend the majority of their time, 80 to 90% of their time, at very easy intensities. So in like zone 1 or zone 2 type effort levels. Whereas they only spend about 10 to 20% of their time at very, very high intensity levels, things like zone 4 and zone 5 efforts. And they spend very, very little, almost no time in zone 3. Now, why is this? Because, like I said, zone 3 carries with it a lot more stress than training in zone 1 and zone 2 without any of the benefits of training in zone 1 and zone 2. But you don't get the same stimulus on the body as you would by training at higher intensity levels in zone 4 and zone 5. So it's essentially this like gray area of training that is really only reserved for when you're getting closer to an actual race or competition. And this is because a lot of endurance races, and this depends on the distance somewhat, but a lot of endurance events, racing takes place in that zone 3 kind of effort level. So if you think of like a marathon, for example, even though a marathon's an endurance event and you might think that it's at a very easy, comfortable effort level, it's not necessarily, especially for those that are truly racing it. It's a pretty hard effort that is in zone 3, almost in zone 4 for some athletes, depending on how fast you're running. And then things like shorter endurance events like half marathon, 10K, and 5K, the intensity level of those obviously starts to go up. But longer endurance events like marathons or even a lot of different triathlon events, racing takes place in zone 3. So zone 3 is typically reserved to work on as one approaches race day. Now, the reason that we spend the majority of our time at lower training intensities is because we know that the total amount of training volume that an athlete can do is related to better performance, right? So if someone can train, and this is just a very general statement, again, it depends on the athlete and how much stress they can handle. But if we have an athlete that has all the time in the world to train, we know that 10 hours of total training time is good, right? You're going to see fitness improvements from those 10 hours of training. But if an athlete can train 15 hours, that might be even better, because 15 hours of total training time a week is going to be a more potent stimulus to improve one's overall fitness. And obviously this diminishes after a certain number of training hours, because you can't just train all day every day. You would never recover. But in general, a little bit more training volume we know is associated with better fitness outcomes, better performance. And the same is also true with total volume of easy training. So we know that the more easy training someone does, the better they're likely to perform. Now, why is this, right? We would think that we would want to be training harder all the time in order to improve our fitness. Well, there's a lot more to fitness than just being able to hold really fast paces. Being able to hold really fast paces is just one aspect of an athlete's fitness. So fitness also encompasses one's aerobic metabolism, their ability to work at very low intensities for long periods of time and to be able to very effectively and efficiently utilize fat for energy, as well as muscular and mechanical efficiency, which is how economical you are at varying paces and intensities. And being very economical or efficient, we also know, is very much so related to better endurance performance. And spending a lot of time at very low intensities allows you to do a lot of training, which is going to give you a greater stimulus to improve your fitness. And then it's also going to be working on those aspects of your fitness that training at really high intensity levels doesn't necessarily work at. Things like developing muscular and mechanical efficiency, as well as really, really developing your aerobic energy system or your aerobic metabolism. And aerobic metabolism or your aerobic energy system is often one of the most overlooked aspects of one's fitness that I find with athletes. A lot of athletes like to just look at VO2 max and lactate threshold as being the primary drivers of one's fitness. And yes, this is true. We want to have a high VO2 max and a high lactate threshold. And that does come about from spending that small portion of time, that 10 to 20% of your training volume training at really high intensities. That's going to improve your VO2 max and your lactate threshold. But if we train that hard all the time, we're not going to be able to accumulate a lot of training volume, and we're going to be doing obviously a lot less time spent at zone 1 and zone 2 effort levels, and we're not going to develop our aerobic energy system. And having a well-developed aerobic energy system almost has like a trickle-up effect in terms of fitness. So the more aerobically fit you are, the better able you're going to be to hold higher intensity. So things like race pace, you're going to be able to hold race pace for a lot longer without mechanically and physiologically breaking down or fatiguing, because you're so aerobically fit. And you're going to be able to hold higher intensities that are closer to your lactate threshold for longer. You're going to be able to recover quicker between really hard efforts during a training session. Or if your race involves a lot of like surging, like crit racing does on bikes, you're going to be able to recover a lot quicker in between those really short bursts of high power outputs. So being very aerobically fit is incredibly important, and it's essentially the base of being a great endurance athlete, is having a very, very strong base of a well-developed aerobic energy system. And so polarized training, again, is spending the majority of our time working on that base, and then a small percentage of the time, because that's all we really need, just a small dose to improve our VO2 max and lactate threshold, but a small percentage of time spent in zone 4 and zone 5. And polarizing one's training intensity chronically over time is in opposition to the zone 3 trap, or doing the majority of your training in zone 3, is the best way to promote long-term improvements. That's month in, month out, year in, year out in fitness as an endurance athlete, as well as, and this is the big key right here, reducing the likelihood of injury, illness, and burnout. So hopefully you find this useful, whether you're an athlete or a coach. I know that especially when I first got into endurance sport, I struggled with this concept, and I know that with some of the athletes that I've worked with, they also struggle to wrap their mind around why I promote spending so much time at very easy intensity levels. But there's a lot of research that's gone into backing up why we polarize our training intensity like so. And it's incredibly important for not only long-term performance, but just long-term health and longevity with being an endurance athlete. So hopefully this was useful for me to describe the difference between the zone 3 trap and polarized training for you. If you're an athlete, hopefully you can identify with some of these things that I talked about and implement some of these practices into your training. And if you're a coach, feel free to share this podcast with athletes who might be struggling to wrap their mind around why you're getting them to shy away from doing all of their training at the same intensity to being able to polarize their training intensity. I think sometimes it's really helpful for athletes to just hear it over and over again, especially from other coaches or other experts. So hopefully if they haven't quite gotten it yet with you explaining it, then hopefully sharing this podcast will be just another voice that they can hear, reiterating the importance of polarizing your training intensity. And again, like I said, I'll be sure to link down into the show notes below the materials related to Dr. Steven Seiler if you're interested in learning just a little bit more about some of the work that he does, as well as Matt Fitzgerald. He has a couple really good books, like I mentioned, 80-20 Running and 80-20 Triathlon, which do a really, really great job of explaining this concept of polarized training intensity and why we do it and what the science is behind it. And then if you have any questions for me, you can always reach out to me at peakenduranceSolutions@outlook.com, or you can message me directly through my website, which I'll be sure to link into the show notes below. Again, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'm looking forward to the next episode with you. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you're listening to us on iTunes and you have a free moment, go ahead and leave us a review. Those reviews are very much appreciated. And if you know of anyone who would be interested in following along to our podcast, please be sure to share this episode with them and let them know to subscribe.